Today we're going to talk about the 8 most impactful tips when sitting the SJT section of the UCAT. As you've probably seen, for this year I've been doing a series where I've condensed all my 10 years of teaching into 8 or 10 tips for each section of the highest impact tips of all the ones that are out there. So this is where I've taken all of my years teaching my students, all the information and tricks and tips that I've learned throughout the years, and condensed them into the most important. Now this is the last section of these series, so I'm going to give you the 8 most impactful for the SJT, and then at the end I'm going to give you the #1 single best tip for each of the sections as a summary, and then some really crucial exam tips for how to score highly on the day and how to prepare. If this is your first time looking at these videos and you want to check out the full series, you can start with the first episode here, but otherwise let's just dive straight in. So the SJT is an important skill to master because not only is it going to come up during your applications to medical school, it will also be part of your foundation training applications and your postgraduate specialty training. It's also useful for your interviews because you're learning how to assess situations and behave appropriately. That's why it's really important to get a band 1 or 2 in this part of the exam, otherwise it will limit where you can apply. And I actually do have a video of what to do if you get a low UCAT score, which you can watch here, and where your options are if you don't have quite the score that you wanted to get. But the first and my most important tip is to learn your definitions. Questions in the SJT are either going to be related to appropriateness or importance, and knowing how to define each level of the 4 rankings is going to be key to you knowing where to place those answers. Let's start by looking at the importance questions and look at definitions for each of the 4 levels so that you know how to categorize them. So very important is that it's essential that you take into account when addressing the scenario. Important is that it should be taken into account, but it's not completely essential. Of minor importance is generally when you can take it or leave it. It's neither here nor there, and it's not going to impact positively or negatively on the situation. Not important at all is that it will impact negatively on the situation and probably something that you actually shouldn't do. But let's just go through some definitions just for completeness. So a very appropriate thing to do is that it addresses some of the issues that have arisen from the situation, and that is generally a positive action towards the context of what is going on in the scenario. Appropriate but not ideal is that it can be done given the scenario, but isn't the best way to go about it. Inappropriate but not awful is something that probably shouldn't necessarily be done, but isn't going to impact the situation negatively or make it worse. A very inappropriate thing to do is something that definitely shouldn't be done and is only going to worsen the scenario. So tip number 2 is how we're going to use these definitions to guide how we approach answering these questions. So when you get to a scenario, read it, take it in, understand what's going on, and then you'll get your proposed action and be given the options of importance or appropriateness according to the question. So when you get your action, the first thing that you should do is decide, is this generally positive or generally negative? Because if it's positive, it's going to be in the top 2 answers. If it's negative, it's going to be in the bottom 2. Then to split hairs whether it's actually going to be the top answer or the second one, or whether it's going to be the bottom answer or the second but bottom answer, you need to ask yourself the following question. If it's positive, you then need to decide, is it all positive or are there some negative features to it? If it is all positive, then it goes to a very appropriate thing to do. If it's positive but not completely the best way to do it, then you go to appropriate but not ideal. However, if you decide generally that the answer is a negative one, you're down in the bottom 2 answers. If it's completely terrible, there are no redeeming features, then it goes to a very inappropriate thing to do. However, if it's generally a negative thing but there are some redeeming features, there are some good aspects of that answer, then it will be inappropriate but not ideal. Tip number 3 is to remember the 2 golden rules that are going to get you through the SJT. Rule number 1 is patient safety always comes first. So if there are any answers that neglect patient safety, they will always be the very inappropriate type answers. However, if there's an answer that prioritizes patient safety, they're generally going to at least be positive, if not a very appropriate thing to do. The second golden rule is that you should never lie. If there are any answers that encourage you to be dishonest, then they will always be a very inappropriate thing to do. And being honest is always going to be in the positive side. Number 4 is know the subjects well that you need to demonstrate skills in to score highly in this section. There are about 7 of those which I'm going to read to you now, and then I'm going to talk about how we're going to perfect each of these. So you need to have knowledge of ethics, teamwork and leadership, communication skills, honesty and integrity, working under pressure, confidentiality, and patient safety. Now for each of these, there are some very specific techniques to help you answer these questions and some criteria that are going to help you how to rank the questions when these specific scenarios come up. And if you want to know a little bit more about that, on my online course, which has about 20 hours of lessons, we go into depth in each of these and exactly what these criteria are and how to tackle the questions. And actually, as it happens, this week, just before I sat down to record this video, I've had 2 students reach out to me, especially to say that they sat the UCAT last year and they both got around 2,300 band 3 and the other one got about 2,400 band 3. And after doing my course this year, they've sat it and they've both got, I think one got 3,060 and another one got 3,100 and something, and both got bands 1 and 2 in their SJT. So I can say with candor that this course has really helped people, and it goes into all the possible questions that come up and techniques that you need to score highly. So if actually you want to check out a little bit more, I've done a video talking about that specific course just here that you can check out. But otherwise, let's crack on with the SJT best tips. Number 5 is to remember that you don't need any specific medical or procedural knowledge to get through the SJT. And that's pretty much all I've got to say about that. Number 6 is that it's important that you pay attention to the responses and not the initial scenario. So don't get drawn into just how bad the situation is at the start. It's actually the action that someone takes in light of that scenario that matters. So for example, if a mistake happens that leads to a patient becoming unwell, that of course is quite a bad scenario. But if the person in the scenario responds well with honesty, integrity, and maintaining patient safety, then that is the best way to respond. So don't fall into the trap of saying that that particular response is bad, when actually it's just the scenario in the first place that is particularly unfavorable. And number 7 in line with that is to remember that this section of the exam is a test of what you should do, not what you would do. So I always think of the SJTs as the what would Jesus do test. So we'll come on to the final tip, but just remember that after this we're going to look at each section, my number 1 tip for each, and then some revision techniques and best practices for when you're preparing for the UCAT. So tip number 8 and my final one of the SJT is to make sure that you read the GMC Good Practice Guidance. All of this SJT scenario stuff is based around the traits and the qualities that they want to see in the doctors. This document outlines exactly what the GMC want to see in their future doctors, and exam writers take directly from this when writing SJT questions. So make sure you give it a read, especially because it will come up frequently throughout your medical school application and while you're actually at medical school itself. So that is it, top tips for all of those sections. So let's do a quick recap and I'm going to give you my number 1 tip for each of these sections. The number 1 thing that I would say for the verbal reasoning is to look out for the common traps that they try and trick you out with. This includes things like dispersion, so spreading the information around, using contradicting statements, trying to trick you to use outside knowledge or false logic when answering questions. If you want to check out the original video I did with all of the traps and how to avoid them, check it out here where you've got everything with my top 10 tips for the verbal reasoning. For the quantitative reasoning, my biggest tip is to know all the calculation shortcuts that you can do to save valuable time whilst maintaining accuracy. With that, there are quite a lot and they're all covered again in my online course, so if you want to check that out, you can check out the link in the description below. Abstract reasoning, my number 1 tip by far is to learn how to spot the patterns. I use an acronym called Spartan IBS. Again, if you want to check out my top, I think it was 9 tips for the abstract reasoning, just check out this video here where I go through all of them and how to spot the patterns. My number 1 decision making tip is to get comfortable with critical thinking key concepts. You can Google those to get some free lessons on some basic critical thinking ideas, but that's going to help you with the identifying assumptions and conclusion type questions that you'll get in the decision making. Again, if you want to check out my channel, there are lots of videos there about the decision making section and how to tackle these. And finally, the good old SJT. My number 1 tip for this is probably to remember that it's all about what you should do rather than what you would do, and then use the GMC guidance to kind of use that as your backbone for how you formulate your standards. One of the most common questions that I get is, when should I start preparing? How long should I prepare for? How much time should I spend each day doing that? So I think as it's the end of this series, I'm going to give you a bit of a guide of kind of where to start, how to think about preparing, and then how much time to spend each day when you actually get to the stage where you're really cranking up the intensity towards the end of your preparation. So I'd say you need to do it in 3 stages. The first thing is that you need to grasp the key concepts. Then you need to put them into practice, and then you really need to sharpen the axe so that you're really tight when it comes to exam day. So with the grasping phase, what you need to do is understand all of the theory. So you need to know all of the questions that come up, all the techniques available, and the best ones to answer each individual type of question. And there are lots of ways to do that. For example, my online course is one, but you can watch videos on YouTube, books, whatever it is to just get that knowledge in your head at the start. Then once you've done all of that, you're ready for the implementation phase, or whatever you want to call that second phase. At this point, you want to start actually practicing some questions. At that stage, you need to go to an online platform where you can do some question banks and just practice the questions. So this is the time where you're just practicing and getting in the reps. And at this stage, I would recommend that you just focus on individual sections at the time so that you can just really get comfortable and used to answering those types of questions and then instinctively knowing what kind of techniques you need to use. At this stage, you don't need to worry too much about time practice because here we're just laying the foundation. Now, once you've got to the stage where you've laid down the foundations with all the sections, it's time to really start cranking it up and, as I say, sharpening that axe, ready for the real exam. So the first thing you want to do before you really start cranking up the intensity is do a mock test to get a flavour of where you're at and use that as a barometer for your progress. The UCAT exam does have some official mock tests, but you want to use these as very precious resources that you ration out very carefully amongst your practice. However, towards the start of this stage, I would say that it's worthwhile doing one timed mock exam just so that you can get an understanding of kind of where you're at and where you need to get to. Once you've got that initial kind of a marker, if you will, out of the way, it's time to start doing time practice in your online question banks. So what I recommend you would do with this is progressive overload. So you start at a time that's comfortable to you and then just slowly but surely start cranking up the intensity. What you want to be doing before you move on to time questions is make sure that you're getting about 80% accuracy when you're doing it in the comfort of your own home without any pressure, and you can make sure that you're getting at least 80% right before moving on to doing it under pressure. And then what you want to do is bit by bit increase the speed or reduce the time to make sure that bit by bit you're just getting a bit faster but maintaining that accuracy that you had previously. It's important to keep monitoring your progress to make sure that you know how you're getting on, kind of where you need to be versus where you are, so you know how much work you need to do to get to your target score. Now, you can use these mock papers along the way to kind of track your process, but I would recommend after the first one's done that you kind of load them towards the end of your practice, so as you're cranking up the intensity, you have more of these to work with. But these are going to help you track your progress and get a good idea of kind of how you're improving as time goes on. Now, an important thing is when you do a timed mock paper, it will be 2 hours, so it'll feel like a lot of work, and after you won't feel much like doing anything because it'll be a bit of an assault on your brain. But once you've had a rest, it's really important to take the time, and it's usually probably another 2 hours to go through all your answers and just work through all the things that you got wrong, but also what you got right and the reasons why, and understand and learn from that theory. So that journey is very hard to put a timeline on, because for some people that journey will be 3 weeks, for some people it will be 3 months to get the score that they want. So that's why I recommend doing the groundwork part of that early, understanding the questions, knowing all the techniques, and then at least doing a mock exam so you can get an idea of where you are. If you've done it all and you do a mock exam and you do quite well in that and feel that with just a short amount of preparation time you can actually do quite well, then well done. That means that you don't need to prepare too intensely. However, on the other hand, if you don't do as well and you're not sure that you're going to do well, then that would mean that you probably need to do a lot more work to get the score that you want. But that process that I've just explained to you should kind of help you work out where you lie on that 3 week to 3 month timeline and exactly how much time you might need when it comes to preparing for your own UCAT. The other thing that I will say is in the day-to-day UCAT preparation, people also ask me, how long should I be spending each day preparing? Well, the thing that I suggest to do is take a step back and look at what the UCAT is doing. The UCAT is a 2-hour test that's essentially mentally bombarding you with a load of brain teasers for 2 hours straight. So you need to get prepared and ready for being able to cope with that pressure for 2 hours without stopping and being on form for the entire exam and all the sections. That's why in my previous videos you may have seen me compare this to sprint training. When someone trains for sprinting, they don't do 5 hours of non-stop sprinting, because of course the intensity and the speed is what matters as well. So really you need to do short bursts, so 2-hour bursts maybe of revision, maybe a little bit more, and then long rest periods to help you recover. It's been proven that meditations and things like Yoga Nidra or something like the Reverie app for a meditation immediately after a deep learning session, any of those practices increase brain neuroplasticity, which helps you learn and apparently increases learning by 50% according to some studies. Then you have your break, and then once you're well rested, maybe a few hours later, or if you've done a morning session, go again in the afternoon, you're then ready to do another 2 to 3 hour session. But the thing that people fall down on is when they try and do these 4 or 5 hour marathon sessions, where if you think about it, your brain is just getting bombarded so intensely. But of course, after 4 or 5 hour sessions like that, it's understandable that your performance starts to suffer a little bit. Again, back to the sprinting analogy, if you were sprinting literally all day non-stop, then of course the speed and the performance is just inevitably going to go down. So now I'm going to give you my top revision tips for the UCAT, and then finally I'm going to give you some tips for how to perform well on the actual day. So number one, to reiterate what I said, make sure you've laid the groundwork and know the foundational skills before you move on to doing timed questions. So my top tips for preparing for the UCAT, just to reiterate a previous point that I've said, is to make sure that you've laid the foundations and are comfortable with all the theory and types of questions before you go on to attempt any questions in the question banks. The next thing is, as I said before, make sure that you're hitting about 80% accuracy with your question bank practice before you move on to doing timed questions. Number three is to make sure that you tackle one section of the UCAT at a time. It shows way much more improvement if you spend intense focus on one particular section and then shows considerable improvement in that before moving on, rather than spreading your efforts and diluting them across all 5 sections. There's a fantastic book by Greg McKeown called Essentialism, and he talks about how individual focus on one thing at a time shows way more improvement in a linear direction rather than random energy scattered across lots of things. And when it comes to the sections, you will have a hyper-focused improvement phase, and then you'll have a maintenance phase, basically to keep the skills that you've had and keep your abilities at a certain score and a certain timing. My fourth tip is, once you feel like you've mastered one section, move on, but then just keep doing the occasional question here and there with the sections that you feel you've mastered, just to keep things ticking along and just keep those skills. And my final tip is to practice on a screen. The UCAT's done on a screen, you'll be doing it on a computer, so get used to mimicking the exam situation as much as possible. And that means really, once you've got used to it and beyond the foundational stage, leave the books behind, because they are not like what it feels like doing it on a computer. It feels different, it looks different, and it is different. So just make sure you get used to that rather than doing questions in a... And the final bit that I'm going to talk about from this monster video is how to perform well on the day. If you have watched any of the videos where I recommend the Andrew Huberman podcast, he talks about sleep being an absolute superpower. The more well rested you can be for the day, the better your mental agility will be and better your score. If you want to have a listen to his podcast, he'll tell you about how to relax the night before and make sure that you get a really good night's sleep. And with that, it's really important to reduce the stimulation. So the evening before, maybe even the afternoon before, don't do any UCAT, just spend the time to relax and get yourself well rested ahead of for a good night's sleep the night before, and just to keep yourself in a place where you're not agitated by questions and things that are bothering you. So while you're doing that, you can do things like prepare all the essentials that you need. So prepare your bag and your ID that you're going to need for the exam. The brain is the highest energy consumer in the whole body, so when you have intense bouts of concentration, you need to make sure that you're providing it with adequate fuel. So make sure that you've eaten a very high calorie meal and that you're super well hydrated. Again, Andrew Huberman on his podcast, I absolutely love this at the moment. He talks about the optimum hydration for when you're doing deep focus or high physical activity. And he says that you should have what really equates to pretty much a pint an hour. He actually divides it into 3 and talks about how much you need every minute, but for the average human, about a pint an hour is what you need to have your brain performing at an optimum level in terms of hydration. And then on the day, things to remember are: use the booklet when necessary, use the calculator only if you need to. If you can do things in your head, that's going to save you so much time. Use the flag function if you're stuck. Be ruthless with questions and just guess and then move on. And then finally, use those keyboard shortcuts that I talked about. So Alt-C for the calculator, Alt-N for next question, Alt-F for flag, and so on. And finally, probably the most important piece of advice that I can give you for on the day is not to panic. You might want to prepare yourself for a situation where you have 1, 2, or maybe 3 questions in a row that you don't know what to do. The worst thing that you can do in that scenario is kind of panic, throw all the techniques and things that you've learned out the window and just go into absolute chaos mode. So if you mentally prepare for that situation and how you're going to deal with it, it's going to help you to remain calm and not be fazed by it and let it 1 or 2 questions affect the subsequent questions and ultimately your performance and score. So that brings us to the end of what has been quite a long video and a really great series. I've enjoyed making this. If you want to check out the playlist of more SJT videos that I've made, especially with about 4 or 5 lessons, including questions and then some techniques as how to answer them, you can check that out here. Otherwise, if you want to see the other videos like this for all the other sections, I've done a video for each of these which is a bit shorter than this because it didn't have all the stuff about exam technique, but it will have about 8 to 10 of the highest impact tips for each of the sections. And you can check out the first one here, which is the verbal reasoning one. So I hope you've enjoyed the series. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in one of those subsequent videos.